Thanks very much and welcome to this presentation on credit risk and portfolio management. I'll start this off with two quotes. I'm not going to read them aloud, they're up on the screen. If you have a look at these two quotes, they're obviously quite different in tone and in character. The top quote is a quote by somebody who obviously knows what they're doing. They're explaining how difficult it is to risk manage a complex portfolio. However, they go on to conclude that if you know what you're doing, if you do things well, things somehow tend to turn out well. The bottom quote is obviously quite different. Without knowing what exactly happened here, it obviously wasn't good, and we can just imagine that the guy who delivered this quote, whatever may have been going through his mind, but he'd probably wish he was dead rather than having to stand somewhere and utter these two sentences. The thing is, both of these quotes came from the same person, Jamie Dimon, and they happened within less than 1 month of one another. Now, he was obviously discussing the infamous London whale trade, so this is the JP Morgan's CIO credit portfolios. Now, why am I putting this up here? Obviously not to be funny at Jamie Dimon's expense, but just to point out how risk managing a complex portfolio can be very difficult, and even somebody as knowledgeable and as experienced as Jamie Dimon may be fooled into believing that everything is under control when it obviously wasn't, and things obviously didn't work out well in this particular case. So the topic of this presentation is quite general, it's credit risk. So if we're going to talk about credit risk, well, we need to look at, well, how we can subdivide this credit risk. So two major sources of credit risk in any portfolio will be actual credit portfolios and bilateral portfolios. So by credit portfolios, we mean credit risk that we acquire deliberately. So this is, we go out and we decide that certain credit is at a price at which it makes sense to either go long or to go short. And then we can subdivide that into liquid tradable exposures and illiquid exposures which we intend to hold to maturity. The bilateral credit risk is more of an accidental credit risk. So this is the credit risk that we acquire to our counterparties every time we put up a trade. And there's two types of credit risk there. The first type is P&L gap on uncollateralized positions. So this is if a position is in the money for us, the counterparty effectively owes us money on this position, and then if they go bust, we lose the money that they owe us. And the second type of bilateral credit risk is risk caps on all positions, whether they're collateralized or not. So in this particular presentation, we're going to focus on two of these topics. We'll talk about illiquid hold-to-maturity exposures, and we'll talk a little bit about risk caps. So let's talk about risk caps. So here we're talking about bilateral portfolios, so we're talking about trades that we have on with some counterparties, and we're talking about the credit risk that we're exposed to in the event of counterparty defaulting on us. So when we're talking about risk managing of these bilateral credit exposures, there are a couple of things that usually come to mind. So obviously the first risk mitigation would be margining or collateralization, depending on the trade and exposure type. And then we're talking about CVA hedging. So this is the hedging of the net moneyness of the portfolio as exposed to the counterparty on a particular net asset. And this would be a typical graph that would be associated with this sort of story. So here we're talking about the uncollateralized portion on some portfolio, depending on different margining thresholds. We see different exposures, and then when collateral is posted, these exposures go to zero, and then they obviously grow until the next collateral posting, etc. So this is a fairly well known and well understood topic in CVA hedging, and that's not what I'm going to talk about today. What I'm going to talk about is something else. So let's imagine we now have a hedged collateralized portfolio with multiple counterparties. what happens when one of our counterparties defaults? Well, what will typically happen is that whatever remains in the portfolio will be unhedged and unbalanced. The risk numbers that were hedged in the original portfolio, so this is the risk numbers from this defaulted counterparty, will now have been replaced by the equivalent risk numbers on the collateral that they posted. Now, the collateral may or may not be correlated with the original positions. However, it is typically quite unlikely that the replacement on the risk numbers will be exact. In other words, when a counterparty defaults on us, our hedged collateralized portfolio becomes unhedged and unbalanced. So we've developed these risk gaps, which we then have to close fairly quickly. Now, typically, if a counterparty defaults on us, the market will be quite stressed. It might move a lot, and the liquidity might thin out, because we won't be the only people that this counterparty defaulted on us. And then typically we will be looking at some P&L losses in this execution. And that's the risk gaps that I'm talking about. So let's draw some diagrams. So let's say we have some cash flows like this, and we're simplifying. We have just two simple cash flows. So let's say we owe money to Bank of America, and we have Credit Suisse owing some money to us, and they're roughly matched in size and roughly matched in timing of the cash flows. But now what happens if Credit Suisse defaults on us? Well, obviously then the money that we owe to Bank of America will be unhedged. So not only will we have to come up with the cash, but we will also have to come up with some way of managing this DV01 coming from this exposure. Now, of course, if we incorporate the riskiness of Credit Suisse, we have to default weigh the actual cash flow that we're receiving from Credit Suisse. And then after the default weighing, we might see that actually there's a gap between the nominal cash flow and the default weighted cash flow. And this gap somehow needs to be hedged. Now, I only picked Credit Suisse here randomly. In the real world, obviously, every single counterparty is risky to some degree or another. Counterparty risk, this sort of counterparty risk, adds additional exposures to a portfolio from the potential risk gaps. Now, this is quite different than CVA and DVA exposure, right? Because CVA and DVA is basically the risk of losing the moneyness of any particular netting set. This isn't about moneyness. We don't care whether it's in the money or whether it's out of money. What we care here about is purely the risk numbers. And it's the effect that this particular netting set has on our risk numbers and how it fits into the portfolio. Now, the risk is obviously proportional to counterparty's default probability, and it's not mitigated through collateralization or margining. Again, because this isn't the risk to the actual cash value of the positions, this is the risk to the risk numbers. So this will lead to counterparty linked adjustment to every single risk number. There will be different components here. So there will be outright credit components, which we can try to hedge with CDSs and bonds. And there will be market components, which we would hedge with market instruments. There might also be correlation convexity coming from correlation between the counterparty exposure and the actual position in that netting set. And in cases of high correlation between this counterparty risk and the exposure that we have, this will have a significant upfront effect on VNL. So this isn't just theoretical. We have spent a couple of months exploring this with Talent Prevon, and we've been looking at developing multilateral counterparty exposure matching platform for forward FX exposures. So here we're looking to manage interbank counterparty exposures on collateralized FX positions, so the actual cash risk will be fairly small, and this is purely about managing these risk gaps. So in phase one, we're looking to manage this purely by switching counterparty exposures. So in other words, we're trying to match counterparties by exposure, and we're trying, if one of the counterparties tends to deteriorate, we try to match them with less other counterparties, and we try to manage all the counterparties in some meaningful, balanced way. In the second phase, we would be looking to start actually actively hedging any particular counterparties that need hedging. Alright, so let me move on to my next topic. So this is about illiquid credits. So in terms of illiquid credits, what we're talking about is pricing and risk managing risks arising from illiquid exposure. So this would typically be real estate projects, infrastructure projects, natural resources projects, transportation projects,